Well, shooting all over the country, including New York, as we just saw in the clip, Brett Story has produced the Prison in 12 Landscapes, and it can now be seen on the PBS series Independent Lens. For more than a decade, he has also worked as an activist, journalist, and academic around criminal justice issues in Canada and the U.S. And now we want to welcome Brett Story to BK Live.
Hi, nice to be here.
Hey, happy to have you. So right off the top, how does a nice person from Canada wind up getting involved in the criminal justice system in America?
Sure. I mean, I was working on issues of criminal justice in Canada too, and I know Americans like to have particular ideas about what's going on up north, but we have a prison system that's also been growing over the past few decades. And really, I began working on prison issues as an outgrowth of my work on poverty and housing. So I was a housing activist for a long time, doing work around gentrification in Montreal, and was dealing with the role of the police in aiding gentrification. And once you start doing work, of course, on policing and what policing does, you inevitably get to who's being locked up and where they're being locked up. So that was how I got into thinking particularly about prison issues.
Who is being locked up in Montreal versus in America? Is it sort of a mirror image, or are things different there?
There are some symmetries and then, of course, major differences. But the most glaring similarity, if you peer inside Canada's prisons and jails, is that these are spaces that are full of poor people, just like they are in America. And they're also overwhelmingly spaces full of poor people of color. So in Canada, you know...
Aren't there many people of color in Canada?
Well, we have a large Indigenous population, and we have many decades of state politics, of displacing and disenfranchising Indigenous people. So we actually hyper-incarcerate our Indigenous populations at a rate even higher than America incarcerates its African-American populations, which is something that people, I don't realize.
I didn't realize that in any way, shape, or form. You know, I have to ask you, the Prison in 12 Landscapes, how did you come up with the sort of inspiration to do a documentary about prison without actually stepping into a prison? Because here in America, you know,
the bars.
It's lockup, it's police, it's everything is always that shot of the clink, 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 clink.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, and I think that those images were sort of saturated with these very, at this point, cliched images of what prison life is like. And I was interested in doing something different, but I was also confronted with what many of us are confronted with, which is the fact that prisons themselves are actually kind of disappeared from view. So, you know, at the same time as the prison population in the U.S. has grown, it's actually harder to access prisons. It's, you know, they're built further away. They're not built in cities anymore. They're increasingly in
gerrymandering,
rural areas, and they're really hard to get inside if you're a journalist or if you're doing any kind of reporting work. Sure. And there's a kind of, you know, I was thinking about that, like what is going on with prisons being out of sight and therefore out of mind, and what's a different way of maybe making visible the prison in our midst and therefore asking people, audiences, to start thinking about prisons in a new way.
How are you sort of able to get people to open up? I know a lot of times where I've seen documentaries, people are always, former prisoners are always a lot of times saying they're very reluctant to share their story. And even on the other side of it with the prison system, a lot of times these representatives are very reluctant to speak to journalists.
Sure. I mean, I think that it helps a lot that I'm, you know, very honest about what I'm up to. I am interested in developing relationships of trust with the people that I talk to, and I feel very grateful that people would open up their lives to me and share their time with me. So when I approach people and ask them to be on camera, I'm very straight up about what I'm doing, why I'm doing it, and I try as best as possible to demonstrate the real respect I have for them, and I think that goes a long way.
So from a chess champ in Washington Park to a guy who puts together care packages for people who are serving time, how did you go about choosing these landscapes to create the tapestry that you've made that isn't stuck in the prison wall?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways it started out just with the very basic idea, okay, if I'm going to make a film that's set entirely on the outside, then I'm working with a visual medium. I need to find images that support that. And so some of those came really through a research process. Like I knew prisons were being built in rural areas. I found out they were being built on top of coal mines in Appalachia, so I went there to see what's going on there. But some scenes happen almost accidentally. So I happened to be a real chess fan and was playing chess.
$5, right?
Documentarians have to make their money somehow, but I was just playing chess actually in Union Square here in Manhattan with a guy and chatting with him, and he was complaining that it was a real struggle to make a living because the rates were going down because so many guys were coming out and setting up boards. And for me, that was just a real shock. I mean, I just didn't know.
It's the reverse prison industrial complex. They're crowding the market now.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that that's really interesting. People don't associate a game with chess with prisoners, but also we forget how difficult it is for people who come out of doing time to find work. That's so right. These guys are making a living while playing chess.
We forget, but I don't know. I drive through. I go home to Baltimore a lot, and when you drive through Baltimore, like here I'm jumping on a train. Yeah. But when I'm driving through the city, my father, he's a correctional officer. He always comments that when he gets off work at 8 o'clock in the morning and he drives up certain streets, he can see all the women and students out on the bus stops. You come back 4 or 5 hours later, and it's nothing. He calls them ghosts. He said just brothers in big white undershirts just standing on all the corners all day long, and just those are the hours that they keep. So.
Yeah, and I think that was another aim of the film, was just to show how one of the reasons we don't see the prison in our midst is because we don't know how to look for it. So, if you happen to be on the street corner at 34th and 7th Avenue on a Friday night or Saturday night, you're going to start seeing, if you know how to look for it, a group of women, mostly women of color, maybe with children, maybe with a small overnight bag, start to gather. And, as the film demonstrates, what they're doing there is waiting to get on the bus that's going to take them on the long overnight journey to visit one of the 54 different institutions that are located in upstate New York.
So 12 landscapes. I wonder what was the 13th, if you had another one to do or one that just didn't come together. I know there's always like one in the can that you wish it would have come through.
Yeah, so. I do have one of those. It's true. I mean, there was many scenes that didn't make it into the film, but I was working really hard to film a training with a group of doulas in Massachusetts who give birthing support to people on the inside who are giving birth. And so that's something that people often forget about, is that there's mothers inside, and there are people who are pregnant, and they're giving birth in many places while in shackles. Yeah. They're going to have to, some of them are going to have to give up their babies. So I really wanted to shed a light on that, and this group of doulas and midwives is actually running trainings to help people go on the inside and give support. So that just didn't work out for a whole bunch of different reasons, but I would have loved to have had it in the film.
I don't like to necessarily lead the audience, but what do you hope people sort of take away from the experience of seeing the documentary?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the film is really an opening, an invitation for people to think differently about what they think prisons do. So this is not a film about crime. It's a film about all the different roles that prisons play in upholding a particular social order. Maybe they're job creation strategies in Appalachia. Maybe they help facilitate gentrification in New York. But I think we as a society need to really rethink what we think prisons are for and what they're doing instead, and maybe how we might have a world without them.
I do have to interject one thing, because everything you said is so true, but then you have to also throw in the fact that we're privatizing prisons now, too. So what do you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that's a problem. I think it's especially a problem with immigration detention. That's where a lot of privatization happens. But I think it's important for people to remember that actually 95% of all prisons in this country are public, which means we're paying for them. It's our taxpayer money. And that's a way to feel more accountability, right? We could demand collectively that our politicians not spend our money in that way. And I think that that's really empowering and important to hold on to.
So before we get out of here, was there anything that surprised you? I know you came away with a lot of facts and figures that are hard and fast, but was there anything that gave you pause?
One of the things that surprised me, so I spent some time in Appalachia in eastern Kentucky, where they're, as I said, building prisons on top of coal mines and all these poor, unemployed coal miners are trying to get prison jobs. And I thought I would go and meet people who were really, you know, law and order, lock them up and throw away the key. And instead, I didn't find that at all. I found people that were really able to be critical of the prison system, but also at the same time hungry for a wage. And I think we need to think about that because there's an opportunity there. We could find a different way to say you can have a future.
Clean energy, anyone? All right, well, thank you for coming here and keeping this conversation going during Justice Week and sharing these unique perspectives. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for everything you're doing.
Story.
Absolutely. And you can see the film on Independent Lens as of now.
PBS.
Yeah, for I think another week.
All right, thank you, Brett Story.
Thanks for having me.
We'll be looking forward to your next work.